Okay, beginning class again. So for those of you who came in last, what's going to happen with the drafts is basically that I will get them back to you within 24 hours. So Cynthia, if you haven't heard from me within 24 hours, just because I get a lot of them and I like to turn them as quickly as possible, I will do my best to send a confirmation. But basically, if you send me a draft and you haven't heard back from me in 24 hours, email me again. I will be getting, if you sent me one last night or you'll be sending one to me in the next hour or so, I'm going to read them over this afternoon. And so you'll get them back tonight at the latest. So I will be reading over drafts today, giving feedback. So that's that. Now, today's class, I want to do it a little bit differently. Basically, I'm tired of hearing my own voice as much. So because of that, we're going to have a little bit less lecturing and more of just a discussion-y. I ask you some questions, you give me some examples, we talk through them. And I have no idea how much of the class today is going to take. It could be a lot, it could be less than usual. I guess we'll see. But basically what we're going to be talking about today is crimes with computers. And that basically means we're going to divide the class up today into a few different parts. The first part is I literally just want to talk about some examples of crimes involving computers. I'm going to open it up and people can talk about their own experiences. They can talk about things they've read about, things they're worried about, anything like that. Once we've got a whole bunch of examples up here and we've talked through them just so we can get a general idea, we're going to talk about what are the ways in which these various examples differ from each other and what do they have in common. And we're going to draw up a little chart of what different types of crimes involving computers are. And the reason we're going to do this is just so we can get a better understanding, because not all crimes involving computers are created equal. And because of this, all of these are things we have to think about whenever we're working in a computer setting. And so I want to make sure that we've all thought about different types, different ways in which these things can be different from each other. And then once that's done, I want to finish up class by talking about crime fighting, or ways in which law enforcement is done with computers, and the ways in which computers have made law enforcement change and the way they've affected things. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Any questions thus far on the plan? And again, if video quality is worse, just let me know. All right. And I will do my best, but expect it to be worse this class in general. All right, so no questions. We're good to go. All right, awesome. Thank you, MD. Okay, perfect. So I now want to open it up of just talking about what are some examples of crimes involving computers. We have fraud. And I put up as my example so far, Operation Olympic Games. We'll talk about these a little bit more in detail, but let's put up some more just in, well, actually, let's talk through them. So Karana, I think you were the one who said fraud. We have another one of spying. So let's talk about these. With fraud and computers, what do we mean by fraud with computers? There's a few different things we can mean. So what are some more concrete examples? Or what do we mean by fraud with computers? What ways can computers assist in fraud? Well, what's just meant by fraud in general? What is fraud? What is it to defraud someone or do something fraudulent? So yeah, fraud is illegal. Fraud is a type of illegal thing, but what makes it different? So fraud includes things like identity theft. So what is identity theft? What is identity theft? Well, what is theft? So taking someone's identity, and what do we mean by identity here? Fraud could be something that isn't, so first off, we've got generally, so let's just go back here. I'm going to take it in the chat order. So fraud is basically just tricking someone and saying something isn't the way it's supposed to be. So fraud can be things in which you say, I am this person when you're really not. And usually it's a matter of saying you are someone you aren't, or you're doing something different from what you say you're doing in a way of gaining personal gain. So it can be telling someone like, I'm the cops and you have to pay a $20 fine. Therefore, give me $20 when you aren't really the cops. Identity theft is a specific type of that in which you're claiming to be somebody else. And it's not just like a general person. You pick a particular individual and claim that you are that person. And very often, as Howard says, it involves stealing very personal information like their social security number, or their driver's license, or their bank account number, or their passport number. So that's what identity theft is. Now, identity theft is a crime that in some sense has been around forever. But what is different with computers? Why is identity theft something that gets talked about more and more recently thanks to the computer? What's changed? And it's tied in with stuff we've talked about the last couple of classes. So what is it that identity theft has to do with computers?
Professor, is the can I say the computers are a new medium to gather that information to get
Exactly.
into?
So that is a perfect one, Jorge. So one thing that computers have changed about identity theft is that it's much easier to gather data about people because of what we were talking about the last couple of classes. Think about 50 years ago, if you wanted to steal someone's social security number, what would you have to do? And this is a creative, like, think about what would you have to do, Jorge?
I mean, I just generally you needed to break into like a physical place.
Yeah.
To read that information.
The only way in which social security numbers were like, they were written on physical pieces of paper, like you have a little physical card, and then some people you write it on a physical form. So you'd either have to break into someone's mail and read it there, you'd have to break into the house and find the social security card, or you'd have to go to some place like a doctor's office, break in there and look at their personal files. Nowadays, though, how do you steal someone's social security? What do you have to do? Yeah, you can hack into their computer. So if it's the sort of thing in which you get into the computer system, there's probably something stored, especially on like a doctor's office computer or something like that. You can now get into that computer system and you can take that information much more easily than ever before. Also, because there's huge amounts of things like social security numbers stored in a single database. So if you were to get access to a doctor's office's like file folder with all the PDFs with the patient's names on it, it used to be that you'd need to go through one at a time to see social security numbers. Now you can collect hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands all at once. If you were to hack into the US government one, you could get the social security numbers of millions of Americans. Or if you hacked into China's social security network, you could get billions of people, or over a billion people's social security number. So that's one way that it's different. Also, because they're all stored in one place, people are much more likely to go for that particular, like it didn't used to be worth it to try to steal somebody's social security number because you would get one number at a time. Now, if you get thousands at a time, you only need one dumb person or one computer not super knowledgeable person to be able to use that information and start to hack into things. So just the amount of information that you can collect. So that's identity theft, pretending to be someone you aren't on the computer. What's another reason why identity theft is so much more common now? Part of it is the storage stuff, but what's another reason? If I tell you I'm the Queen of England, right now, I say I'm the Queen of England, there's recently been a lot of there's been a lot of things about my family in the news. I can tell you all about what's been happening in the in Buckingham Palace and in Windsor. What are you going to tell me when I try to convince you I'm the Queen of England? Right now, look at me through the screen. What are you going to say to me when I tell you, yeah, you're going to tell me I'm not. I'm not the Queen. Why are you going to be able to say this to me? Yeah, you see me. Exactly, Cynthia. If I send you an email that says I'm the Queen of England, how can you be, you can't see me in an email. Exactly. So another reason that identity theft is so much more prevalent is it's harder to tell when somebody's lying, which ties in with what Anwar is saying of social engineering. So remember a few times ago, I talked about what's social engineering. So therefore, with social engineering, what you do is you put someone in a position in which they can think that you are somebody that you aren't, and you trick them into it. So for instance, I can't put on a fake face like on the street. It's very difficult. I mean, I guess there are things, you get a major reconstructive surgery, but it's much harder to look like somebody you aren't when you're interacting with a person face to face. Nowadays, because so much is online, you can put a fake profile picture. So you put a fake profile picture, and now all of a sudden, it's much easier to pretend to be someone you aren't. So that's another reason why identity theft is really taken off and gets talked about more. I mean, you've always had cases of people pretending to be somebody they aren't. People who just lie about their names. But nowadays, we're interacting on computers so often, it's much easier to pretend to be someone you aren't. All right. And another reason money is another aspect is because of the nature of the interconnectedness. Stealing someone's identity is much more likely to get you the ability to get more money. And so, yeah, an example here, catfishing is another type of crime. So catfishing is kind of related to identity theft. What is the definition of catfishing? And I don't literally mean going out and catching catfish. What is it to catfish someone? Anyone know?
It's basically, I think it was like, like what Howard said, it's like post a picture of yourself, or post a picture of somebody else and pretend that you're somebody else. Yeah, lying.
So generally with catfishing though, it's usually not a matter, sometimes it's a matter of being somebody who already exists, but very often with catfishing, it's almost you create a fictional person to become. So you take a picture of somebody and then you make up your life story. So that's another case of this, is it's pretending to be somebody you aren't. Very often a made up sort of individual when you're interacting on the internet. So catfishing is related to identity theft and they kind of overlap, but very often the person who, very often in an identity theft case, you are pretending to be somebody else who exists. In a catfishing case, you're pretending to be somebody who doesn't really exist and using that for your gain. So it'll be things like pretending to be a sick person and collecting money for your medical bills, when really you're pretending to be a sick old lady when you're a healthy young man. That's catfishing. All right, so these are the ones we've talked about first. And now, what are other types of fraud that can be carried out on the internet? It's not just about pretending to be somebody you aren't. What other types of fraud are there? Mail fraud. So what is mail fraud? Tax fraud? What are all of these things? It's basically just using a computer system to give false information for your own gain. So tax fraud is you lie about how much money you make so you pay less to the government. Mail fraud would be a sort of thing in which you use the mail to convince people to give you things based on letters they receive. So you say, this is your utility bill. So this is another case where computers are much easier to use, like old snail mail. Most people don't see their snail mail. If you send, also it costs money, you have to pay per stamp and find people's address. Email addresses, you just send it out in huge quantities. So fraud is a really general one. All right, spying. Let's jump down here. What do we mean by spying here? And how has the internet changed spying? There's many different senses of spying here. But what do we mean by spying in the sense of crimes involving computers? And there's a few different ways to go here. There's not right and wrong answers.
Spyware?
Yeah, so one thing we can say is spyware. So let's just put up spyware. What is spyware?
Basically, it's something that you don't take notice of usually, and it doesn't really affect your PC performance, but it sends back information to wherever it's supposed to be sent.
Yeah, spyware is usually a rather small piece of software that is installed in the background in your computer. It collects data and sends it off to whoever it was that installed it on your computer. And so what spyware, there's many different types of spyware, but yeah, what it basically is doing is it monitors whatever someone's doing on their computer. And you can set up spyware so that it looks for certain keywords or key things. So for instance, you can set up a spyware program that looks for social security numbers. Social security numbers have a very particular format. There are 3 digits, dash, 2 digits, dash, 4 digits. So what you do is you tell a computer, like the spyware will say, look out for 9-digit numbers laid out in this format, and then it'll collect all of them and send them off. Also, you can set it up so that anytime someone enters something in a password field, the spyware will record that password. And so this sort of thing is just a way of monitoring what people are doing on their computer, collecting that data and sending it off to someone. But there are other ways in which computers are used for spying, and spying in a more general sense. So what are some other ways in which computers get used for spying that you've probably heard of? I'll give you a clue. Yeah, webcams. You can theoretically, and it has been done, hack into a webcam and literally watch somebody through their own computer. So that's another type of spying that happens. And that ties in some sense, with cyber stalking. So what is cyber stalking? Well, what is stalking?
Basically, monitoring somebody's like activities without like having any punishment, I guess.
Yeah, it's following somebody who you do not have the authority to follow. So basically, if it's not your own child who you're keeping up with, then it's stalking. If it's not like somebody who you legally are a guardian over, so that like you're supposed to and allowed to follow your child's every movement if they're like 3. But stalking is when you're following somebody who is an adult or isn't you're not the legal guardian of, and you are following them and collecting information on their movements or just watching them. So what is cyber stalking then?
Like stalking people's profiles or any like digital data, like not physically stalking somebody, but like just monitoring like their online activities.
Yeah, so cyber stalking, and this is actually, there's kind of a blur here where stalking and cyber stalking can blend together. But technically what cyber stalking is monitoring someone's computer profile and watching their every move. And very often what this is a case in which you are going to then use that information to maybe even stalk them in real life. So it's a sort of case in which, like, you know, there's all these cases in which somebody has a huge crush on somebody else. And instead of just like somebody has a crush on a celebrity. And so they start off just Google searching them. And then they really go down on a rabbit hole and start following their every movements and figuring out their schedule and looking up everything about them. And you start off just by monitoring the cyber stuff, but very often things that are posted on cyber can lead to real stalking as well. And related in with this is a case, key logging is a special way in which this can happen. What is key logging? Howard, do you want to give a definition for it? Or anybody else?
What, for key logging?
Yeah, key logging.
Oh, yes. Check what somebody types.
Yeah, Howard says it's basically a program you install into a computer that just monitors everything somebody types. So it just like runs in the background and collects this information. So every time someone types a password, it'll be just like printed out there. So it just literally will put everything. So that would be another instance in which that's kind of like, very often that can be used in identity theft, but it can also just be used to collect information on people. blackmail. What is blackmail, generally speaking? What is it to blackmail someone? Yet someone is forced to do something to prevent their personal information from being released. Or you, so it's usually like you have some compromising information about someone, and then you use this information to force them to do something that they don't want to do. So it is very similar to peer pressure in a lot of ways. But very often it'll be things like, well, classic cases that you see in movies is somebody's having an affair, somebody else finds out about it and says, either you give me some money or I'm going to publicize that you're having an affair. I'm going to tell the newspapers that you're cheating on your husband. I'm going to tell the newspapers you're cheating on your wife. And so in these sorts of cases, it's this sort of thing has gone on forever. People have been blackmailing each other for most of history. But again, computers have changed it for the simple reason that it's much, much easier to get information to blackmail people with. Because so many of us take pictures on our phones that can be that go and get stored on the cloud. If somebody were to hack into the cloud, bingo. Also things like, because your phone is constantly tracking where you are, the places you're going are much easier to find out. And if you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, it is easier for someone else to find out about it. So we've got spyware, keylogging, blackmail, fraud. We now have espionage. What is espionage? And this is one that I think is good to bring up because it's kind of a blurry line. What do we typically mean by espionage? Well, first off, who carries out espionage? So it has to do with collecting information, but if I just collect information on you all, it doesn't quite count as espionage. Spies, and specifically who just spoke? I just cut
typically it's like governments actually carry out this.
Yeah, espionage is information collecting carried out by a sovereign government. So who are some famous spies? They can be fictional or real. The most famous one probably has 3 numbers associated with his name. He's not a real person.
Oh, yeah,
Snowden is one, but James Bond is the one I was thinking of, 007. So basically what it is somebody who is an agent of the government whose job it is to collect information on other governments. So that's what we mean by espionage, is nation states gathering information about other nation states that don't want the one who the information is being collected about to know about it. So, you know, the weird thing about James Bond is that he always says what his name is, but in real life, FBI or CIA would be the other, like, these are what we're talking about with espionage. These are these organizations consisting of spies who collect information about other governments. And so because of this, espionage is something that has been going on forever. Again, this is not something necessarily new. However, how has espionage been changed by computers? What is the major difference here?
Professor, I want to say again the same thing, that you don't need to send somebody, an agent, to a foreign country.
Exactly. So what James Bond, now like back in the James Bond movies, they always have to send James Bond somewhere to get whatever it is he wants. Nowadays, most spying is done without ever leaving the country. The #1 spy tool these days is the computer. The majority of spies just do it from a computer anywhere in the world. So it used to be the case that if you wanted to collect information, you had to send a physical agent on the ground to collect it. However, nowadays, you can do it from just about anywhere. So some of the nations that are the biggest, like have the largest cyber espionage networks are places that you don't think of as having large populations or as places where necessarily they're even close to where it is that they're hacking. So for instance, the US has a huge hacking network or a huge cyber espionage network, and we carry out our espionage. It's not like we're just collecting information on Canada. We collect information on everyone worldwide. North Korea has a huge cyber espionage network, and they do it even though North Korea is not an especially wealthy nation. What they do is they have a lot of trained hackers who generally live outside of North Korean boundaries and do espionage, information collecting for the North Korean government from somewhere like Thailand or from India. So to give a classic example of it, how many people have heard of Operation Olympic Games? Has anyone heard of this? It was basically one of the first famous incidents of cyber espionage or cyber sabotage that got out into the public. It's the original case having to do with Stuxnet. This is becoming ancient history, but it's worth bringing up because it's the oldest that we know the most about. Has anyone heard of this? Either Stuxnet or Operation Olympic Games, which is what the official title of it was.
I heard of the Olympic Games. I can't really remember what it was, but I think it was like something about like the Olympic Games getting hijacked or something, like
Not
the feeds.
Quite. That's not quite it. It was more the code name for a special operation that was carried out. I can never remember what year it is, but it's probably about 10. It's more than 10 years, I think, at this point. I think it was like 2000 and it was like 2006, 2007, 2008. So we're talking almost 15, 20 years ago at this point, or I guess 15 years ago. But basically, here's what it had to do with. The main players were the following: USA, Iran. So the United States, Israel, Iran. We've all hopefully heard of these countries. Does anyone know anything about how these countries feel about each other? How does the US feel about Israel as a nation, generally speaking? Our government.
Usually very hostile. Like that's why we went to war.
No, as an ally, actually.
Yeah, Israel and the US are allies.
Oh, wait, I forgot. Yeah, my bad.
These two are friends. And how do they feel about this one?
As a foe, they see it as an enemy.
So generally speaking, the US and Israel are allies and have been since Israel came into existence in the late 40s after World War II. And Iran, while not technically an enemy, we don't really go to war with them. We haven't put troops on the ground. There's a lot of tension. And one of the main things there's been tension about is what? What is Iran constantly interested in doing, and that countries like the US and Israel don't want them to do?
Nuclear development.
Yeah, Iran, as a matter of fact, does not have a nuclear program. And they have wanted to have one because basically, as North Korea's discovered, you can be a very small country, but around the world, the moment you get nukes, everyone has to take you seriously. So what Iran has been trying to do for years is get nuclear weapons. Now, getting nuclear weapons is not simple. You cannot just go on eBay and buy a nuke. Instead, what you have to do is produce it yourself, which a lot of nations, or have them already. If you don't have them already, does anyone know what the main ingredient in a nuclear weapon is? It's a chemical on the periodic table.
Uranium.
Uranium, or it's plutonium too, I think, right?
Uranium,
the hydrogen.
Plutonium, yes. Or plutonium. Basically, these are chemicals that are very easy to break down and cause the atoms to explode in a very big way. However, in order to make nuclear weapons, we're going to concentrate on uranium so I have a little more room. You can't just like dig uranium out of the ground and make it weapons grade uranium. Rather, what you need to do is put it in some chemical processes or put it through some processes that allow you to get incredibly enriched uranium so that the uranium you have is incredibly pure and is then pure enough to be turned into nuclear weapons. And basically the way this gets done is with centrifuges. Now what a centrifuge is it's basically just a device that spins things. I'm gonna tilt this up a little bit because I'm tired of leaning over. It's basically a device that spins really, really, really quickly. So you basically put a test tube in with something in it. And then what happens is when it spins, the denser stuff goes to the bottom, the lighter stuff stays on top, and then what's left at the bottom is going to be a very pure uranium. So that's how you make nuclear weapons. So what ended up happening was the US government and Israel found out in the early to mid 2000s that Iran was starting to make a uranium refinement center with these centrifuges. However, they were making them in Iran. Therefore, the US government and Israel really wanted this program to stop. The problem is you can't just send spies into Iran. You can't just send soldiers into Iran without starting a war. So what did they do instead? Anyone have any ideas? Well, here's the little more background. These centrifuges are incredibly high-tech pieces of equipment. They need to be controlled down to 1/10 of a degree, and they have to spin at a very, very particular rate. If they spin at any other rate, it won't work. If the temperature's off, not only might it not work, it might explode. So what is capable of making sure that things stay at a very particular temperature and spin at a very particular speed?
Computers.
Computers are. So these things were hooked up on a computer network. And specifically, they were in a computer network in an underground bunker in Iran, where basically in this network, it was not connected anywhere outside, but inside you had the centrifuges. So inside this network were the centrifuge computers. So what is it that the US government and Israeli government, and there was evidence that the initial information came through the Dutch and various other things, but it was basically a bunch of European powers decided for reasons that they thought were legitimate to, they didn't want these centrifuges to continue. So what ended up happening? Any guesses or anyone know?
They hacked into it and made it blow up.
Yeah, that's literally what they did. What they did, no one quite knows how they got into the network because it was closed. They either got somebody who worked there on their side. So in that sense, they had a actual spy, or what seems more likely is they literally just dropped some USB thumb drives somewhere in the area. One of the scientists who worked there picked up the thumb drive, plugged it into a computer at the office, and it uploaded this virus, the Stuxnet worm. What the Stuxnet worm did is it basically just made the centrifuges spin faster than they were supposed to, and they just started malfunctioning and blowing up. In so doing, the US government temporarily, and the Israeli government and everyone else involved, temporarily slowed down the Iranian nuclear program. And what ended up happening is the Iranian nuclear scientists discovered we could either get this back up and running, or we can go to the negotiating table because they clearly do not want us to do this. So this was a case in which it was pure espionage. It was government organizations working together to stop another government organization from doing something. But the key difference is no US citizens ever entered Iran. Rather, this was carried out from halfway around the world in a way that never would have been possible before the year 2000. So this is a really classic, clear case to show something that is, according to the Iranian government, this was a crime. This was an act of aggression by a foreign nation. And so this is a case in which espionage, and generally espionage is considered a crime by whoever the espionage is being done to. So these are the sorts of cases that we're talking about. What are some other crimes to throw up here? I'm going to put some more. I'm going to put up one of my favorites. Hitting someone with a laptop. If you hit someone over the head with a laptop, you are committing assault, and you are assaulting them with a laptop. So it is a crime with a computer. Anyone have any others they want to talk about or things they want to bring up of other types of crimes involving computers? Give me 1 second to grab my notes. Hitting someone with a camera would be another one. Yeah, any sort of hitting of somebody with a physical object. Another one would just be something of, see what others, there were a couple others on here I really wanted to make sure I brought up.
I was thinking of ransomware, but
ransomware is a really good one. So we talked about ransomware a couple classes ago. What is ransomware?
basically encrypting files on a person's computer and asking for money.
Yeah, it's almost another form of blackmail, but instead of telling people you're going to give out something that they don't want out, what you're basically doing is locking them outside of their own computers and saying, pay me money and I'll let you get back in. So that is another classic type of cybercrime. And it is not legal to do this, but it is something that happens and it's something that's common. And it's becoming more and more common. What are some other types of crimes involving computers? I'm going to put up SolarWinds because I want to talk about that one a little bit more later. That's the one that I had the additional reading about.
Professor, what about like when you mess around with someone's website, I guess?
Yeah,
Like
so there are multiple ways of doing this. So one thing would be to log into someone's website and do things to it that cause it damage. So just like going in and damaging a website. But another version of that, I think this was also something that I talked about a couple classes ago, are DDoS attacks. So yeah, going in and altering data. So if you go into a computer system and you just alter the data that's stored there. So if you just go onto a website and you manage to change the website around in a way that causes damage. So there was a case a few years ago that made it public news because of the fact that basically a group of hackers thought it would be really funny to go onto the US epilepsy website. So it's like a US organization that works in encouraging and providing resources for people with epilepsy. So first off, what is epilepsy?
I think it was like if you see a bunch of flashes of color and then you have like it's like a attack, like a heart attack type, or like panic attack.
Yeah, a seizure is basically your brain shoots electricity out of control in such a way that's unmanageable, and your body tends to convulse because your brain is overwhelmed with electrical energy. So, and very often, the way that epileptic fits are set off is there's types of epilepsy that are triggered by flashing bright lights. So basically, that almost primes the system to cause your entire system to convulse and go out of control. And seizures can be very dangerous because while you're having a seizure, you might bite your tongue off. You can hit your head on something. It's rare that it's going to cause the seizure itself is not going to generally cause damage to you. It's rather that while you're having a seizure, you are physically out of control and can cause yourself hurt. So what did these people think would be funny? Well, they went to the US, this organization whose goal is to provide information to people about epilepsy, and they changed the website so that on the front page was a bunch of flashing lights. So people who went to this website interested in getting assistance for epilepsy were instead triggered into having an epileptic fit. So this is a case in which somebody has gone and damaged the website. What is it? By contrast, a DDoS attack is one in which you send a lot of, so just like anything else, if all of you were to ask me a question at once, I wouldn't be able to respond and give everyone attention. Instead, I would just be overwhelmed and would shut down. It's the same thing with computers. If a website has 20 people trying to access it at once, it can handle it. If 20 million do, the website breaks. So a DDoS attack is a case in which you get a large number of computers to try to contact a particular website all at once, in so doing, causing that website to break. And that can be a problem if you're something like Amazon, where if you can't access, if customers can't reach Amazon, they can't pay for things, and that will hurt Amazon. If you're a politician who uses your website for fundraising and somebody shuts it down, or if you're a class, you're trying to have class and your Zoom, too many people try to get on and it shuts down. That is the sort of case that can be very problematic. So DDoS, altering data. So take a break here for 1 second. And what I want to do here for a second is pause. And I want you all to look at this list of things. I want you all to take a look. And what I want you to do is think like, what do these things have in common? And what do they not have in common? So for instance, all of them involve a crime and all of them involve computers. but they aren't all the same. Like spyware and identity theft and catfishing have a lot in common, but Operation Olympic Games and something like hitting someone with a laptop, they also have a lot of differences. So what I want you to do now is just take 5 minutes. I'm going to pause the video while you all do this and just write down some things that differentiate certain cases from one another. So you could just pick 2 cases and be like, a DDoS attack is different from spying because blah, blah, blah. But I want you all to write this down. And then what I want to do is reconvene in 5 minutes and have everyone contribute and highlight the differences between these cases. So 5-minute break, during which time you will do this. Then we will jump back in and plow through for the rest of class. All right? Everyone on board? So just take 5. And there aren't right answers here. There are not wrong answers here. I just want everyone thinking about this and just creatively thinking of patterns that you see. And more importantly, ways in which they differ. Because what I want to do next is talk about why some of these differences are significant in a bigger picture sort of sense. All right, I will be right back in 5 minutes, and you all will have a great list of things that they have in common or different, or just some things that you pick up on. All right, I don't know if it's been 5 minutes, but it's been enough. So the first thing I want to bring up here is Anery's point. Most of them are non-violent. So I'm going to write up in red here. So I think this is a really good point to bring up. And I've never really thought of them this way, but it helps us see something that I have thought of. But this is also just a great point in its own right. So a lot of the vast majority of these are non-violent crimes. So what do we mean by non-violent here?
No one really gets physically hurt.
Yeah, there's no physical harm here. So which ones are there actual physical harm from? This one is just about the only one I see that has direct physical harm in the actual case itself.
Maybe espionage, but I don't know, because if you're blowing up something, you're kind of hurting people in the process, most likely.
Yeah, and so I think you can talk about certain cases, but generally, like, they can cause damage. So for instance, in the Operation Olympic Games case, if a centrifuge explodes and someone's nearby, it can have this like collateral damage. But in terms of direct influence, direct crime, there's this one and then maybe a couple of the others. So this is a really key point. Pause for a second, ask, why is it that so many of these are cases that are non-violent? So for instance, ransomware. Why is ransomware a non-violent crime? What is it about ransomware?
It's because it's digital. It doesn't have anything to do with like anything physical. So
Yeah.
like instead of hitting somebody on the street, it's like since cyber laws are like different, they don't consider it violent or like physically violent because nobody's really getting physically hurt, and it's only digital.
And this is a key. The first thing you said there, which is really key, is ransomware is digital by its very nature. Like, I cannot commit ransomware on your brain. I cannot put my hands around your brain and say, I'm now encrypting your brain. Like, that is not a thing that can happen. I can only do it to computer files. Jorge, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, no, Professor. I just like a side note. When you talk about non-violent, does that have to exclusively be touched with like a physical thing?
Yes. So
it has to.
Speaking, and this is a legal term. Usually, the way violent versus non-violent gets defined in law is that violent means a physical damage to the human body. So murder, assault, that's what we would mean by violence. And non-violent are other things. So when you're looking at computer crimes, what you're finding is that a lot of them can cause damage down the line, but they don't count as violent because they don't directly involve hurting a person. Now, this is because of the fact that a lot of the things we talk about in terms of crimes with computers, I'm going to race up here just so we have a little more room. A lot of these are what the book calls a genuine cyber crime. And what we mean by a genuine cyber crime is a crime that only exists in cyberspace or in software. So there are certain types of crimes that could not exist without computers. So very often they're crimes about property, and specifically digital property. So for instance, you cannot have ransomware without having a computer, like a file that is being encrypted. Another thing, DDoS attacks. Is a DDoS attack by this definition a genuine cybercrime? Well, yes, it is, because by definition, what a DDoS attack is to attack a website. You cannot DDoS attack a non-digital thing. So DDoS is another case of a genuine cybercrime. What are some others that are up here that would be count as genuine cybercrimes?
Spyware, I think.
Spyware, exactly. Spyware has to be a genuine cybercrime. You can't spy on someone's digital properties unless it is itself a computerized system. Now, to be clear, these are often related to things that are not purely digital or are not just cyber crimes. But other things, keylogging, unless you've got a computer, you can't monitor, like keylogging by definition involves a computer because what you're monitoring is a part of the computer. Contrast that with a case of hitting someone on the head with a laptop. Well, in some sense, it involves a computer, but the fact that it's using a laptop in no way changes the nature of the crime. Like if you hit someone on the head with a laptop, you'll get 5 years in prison. If you hit them with a hammer, you'll also get 5 years in prison. If you punch them in the face, still 5 years in prison, provided you do the same amount of damage in each case. So one of the key things about one way of differentiating these crimes is to say some are genuine cyber crimes and others are just, I'm going to erase this up here so we have more room. So the first difference I want to talk about, or I want to put up on the board, is we have most are non-violent, and that's in part because we have this difference between cyber-related crimes and genuine cyber crimes. And so a cyber-related crime is just a crime that involves a computer, but doesn't necessarily involve a computer. It could have been carried out without a computer. A genuine cybercrime is one that by its very nature requires a computer to even exist. So think of this as the sorts of cases in which like any type of hacking is going to be a genuine cybercrime because you cannot hack into anything other than a computer system. By contrast, something like child pornography websites, they are, the fact that they're a website is kind of irrelevant to their illegal nature. Exchanging child pornography is illegal whether you hand out physical pictures or you put it on a website. What's different is the ease with which people can access it and the ease with which people can exchange this sort of information. Another thing, Cynthia says, keylogging is similar to spyware because they both have the process of keeping track of data that you are controlling. One can be you moving around on your screen, the other is typing. So another thing to bring up is that another distinction we can bring up is, are you changing or just monitoring data? And so another thing to keep in mind is that there are differences in the crimes based on whether you're actively causing harm or doing things to a system, as opposed to just collecting data from the system. And very often a case in which you are monitoring the data will lead to a case of changing it, but they are not necessarily the same. So for instance, the punishments in the physical world differ. So if you're just monitoring data, you have to get into the system or you have to get into the place, but you don't actually have to cause any damage to it. So in a physical house, what would we call it if you just enter the house and watch someone? What would we call that as a crime?
Trespassing, isn't it?
Trespassing, yeah. So trespassing What would it be to damage property once you're inside of it? Starts with a V.
Vandalism.
Yeah, vandalism. So this is another thing that's worth bringing up. So you can also differentiate crimes in terms of what you're actually doing. And this exists both for the genuine cybercrimes, but also, or for the cyber-related crimes, but more importantly for genuine cybercrimes. And what we have within genuine cybercrimes is just like in the real world, you can put it into cyber vandalism. You can do it into cyber trespassing. And you can have another one, which is you don't change something and you don't damage something and you don't just look at it. What else can you do? What else could you do with something? Especially if you really want it. You don't want to break it and you don't just want to look at it. What might you do with it?
Is it use it for your benefit?
Use it or steal it. So this is piracy. So within the genuine cyber crimes, we can divide it into cyber vandalism, cyber trespassing, and cyber privacy or piracy. So cyber piracy is stealing digital files. Cyber trespassing is just hacking into a system and just monitoring what's going on. And cyber vandalism is going into a computer system and breaking it. And all of these have parallels in the real world. They have parallels where, you can steal a digital copy of something. You could also steal a physical copy. You can break into someone's computer system, or you could break into their house. You can break their website or cause their website not to work, or you can throw eggs at their house. All of those are possible. But it's important to realize that within the genuine cyber crimes, there are these sorts of differences. What is another way in which these things differ? So let's talk about another difference between Operation Olympic Games and hitting someone with a laptop. We've said one of these is violent, the other is not. One of these is a genuine cybercrime, if you think of it in terms of breaking into the Iranian computer system. The other is not. But what's one other way in which these two differ?
Professor, I was thinking also when you are trying to find the culprit or who committed the crime, it's harder for the espionage or the in this case the Operation Olympic Games to just point out someone.
That's exactly what I wanted to highlight. So you read my mind here. Who carried out the crime is very different in a particular case in multiple senses. In one sense, this one is, we now know, carried out by the US government and the Israeli government and several others, while this one is carried out by a particular person. I mean, unless you and your friend are like 1, 2, 3 and hit somebody else on the head at the exact same time, generally you're only hitting one person. So yeah, it's crime against, another difference is who is getting affected. Is one of them is hitting a person and the other is hitting property, but also it's who's committing it. And there are a few different ways. I'm gonna erase these here just because I want a little extra room. But in a case like this, it's who is doing it. And this has a few different elements. So part of it is who's doing it, as in government versus individual. But another difference is how hard is it to tell who is doing it? If you're hitting someone on the street with a laptop, it's pretty easy to tell who did it. If there's a hack happening on your computer, it is much more difficult to figure out who is doing it. And both of these have implications. And we'll be talking about them a little more when we get in a few minutes when we're talking about stopping crime. But can everyone see why is this difference between telling how hard it is to tell who's doing it is going to have implications down the road? And also, whether it's a government who's carrying out this crime or an individual is also going to have implications. So let's just talk generally speaking. Why is it important to differentiate in these different sorts of ways? Why is it important to recognize the difference between cyber-related crimes and genuine cyber crimes? So just thinking intuitively, why is it important to talk about genuine cyber crimes as a special class of things? Why do we need to keep cyber vandalism apart from regular vandalism? Or why is it useful to separate them in our minds? Well, let's talk about a simple case. All right. You hit someone over the head with a laptop. What happens to you? You do it in broad daylight and there are 26 witnesses. What happens?
You probably get recorded and you probably get arrested by police.
Yes, you get arrested. You now get in front of the judge. What do they say to you?
You're guilty for X crime of assault.
Yeah, assault. You are guilty of assault. And not only that, there are laws about assault that have been in place in the United States for a long time. There are many cases you can point back to. Now imagine a case in which you throw a laptop through someone's window and you break the glass. You've committed vandalism, and there are very clear laws around vandalism. Now, however, let's say that you hack into someone's website and cause damage to their website. What is the problem here? What is a worry that comes up immediately?
How can you get the website back to its original state, and what data has been altered?
So one question is there are these practical questions of what data has been altered, how can you fix this problem? But even more generally speaking, what is the judge having to do right now?
He has to determine who did it, and like also at the same time deem like how much how much damage is worth the punishment, or the punishment worth the amount of damage it did.
Yeah, so here's a question of and there's practical and theoretical questions here. And by practical, what I mean is like actually figuring out the details of what to do. And theoretical means the bigger picture sort of questions that arise. So in this case, if somebody throws a laptop through a window, there are laws in place that tell you how this person should be punished. If, however, you break someone's website, it is, well, have you committed a crime of vandalism? Is cyber vandalism a type of vandalism? Like, here's a question. If I go up to your house and I take a bottle of spray paint and I draw something offensive on your wall, should I be punished in the exact same way as if I say you leave your computer logged on, like you're at John Jay, somebody forgets to log out, they leave their computer logged on, they leave their Facebook logged on, and you go on their Facebook wall and type something offensive. Is that the exact same type of crime? Should they be punished in the exact same sort of way? No,
You have to separate those because it might be too severe for like if you put both of them in the same category, like the amount, like even if you do the smallest thing on the cyber, if you're getting judged as the same, is going to be like too much for the action.
So here's an initial worry is it looks like if we use the laws we've always had for crimes, including cyber, like the sorts of crimes that are cyber related have always been around, things like ordinary vandalism. So it's very difficult to then say, so these are the laws we have. So if we come up with a case of cyber vandalism, like, do we really want to say you should be punished using the same old laws we've always had? As Marcus just brought up, it seems like in certain cases, it's too strong. A more classic case is imagine stealing 1,000 movies. Back 25 years ago, what would it take to steal 25 movies? You'd have to break in somewhere and get 25 boxes of movies. Nowadays, how many of us are guilty of stealing digital property online? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I'd be willing to bet all of us are guilty of it at some point in our lives. All we had to do was Control-C, Control-V. Do we really want to say that if you illegally download one episode of Game of Thrones, which you can do by accident, hell, your cat can accidentally download a movie if it steps on the keyboard, right? Do we really want to say that that should be punished just as harshly as stealing things in the past? But if not, there's now a practical worry of how the hell are we supposed to decide whether or not you are guilty of this, like how you should be punished. If you aren't going to be punished for stealing a movie, like if you download a file, a torrent illegally, and we don't want to say you should be punished just as harshly as if you broke into a movie theater and stole their physical pieces of equipment, do we really want, how then do we decide how you should be punished? So does everyone understand this practical worry here of, as genuine cyber crimes come into existence, very often what we're finding is the laws around these things don't really match up well with the crimes themselves. There seems intuitively like cyber trespassing and physical trespassing are different. Therefore, we shouldn't have, if you log into someone else's computer and just like fool around and not change anything, should you really be punished as hard as somebody who like picks the lock of a door and walks inside? Well, it's not clear. And because of that, it's not clear how one should be punished.
Professor, I was just going to say that sometimes you could argue that it's more damaging. Those cyber crimes could reach like levels that you can't really do physically damage the way you could do it.
Flip side. That's a great point, Jorge. This flip side of certain cyber crimes, though, are even worse than their cyber-related relatives. For instance, like the amount of data you can steal. And so it seems like what we're doing in a lot of these cases is taking almost a utilitarian approach to things. So remember, what does a utilitarian believe? This was back a few classes. You judge how bad something is by how much harm it causes, and you judge how much, how good something is by how much pleasure or happiness or good it brings. Well, it seems like in some cases, what we're stuck doing is saying, well, because these genuine cyber crimes are in some cases worse than their not cyber related or their cyber related cousins. So, you know, like stealing digital files versus stealing physical files, you can steal a lot more digital files at once. It seems like what you have to do is start to calculate the consequences of these actions. You have to judge, like, how bad is this? Well, it depends on what the actual consequences are. But what's a practical worry here? What is a practical concern of judging people based on the consequences of their digital behaviors? Well, who's generally deciding how harsh to punish someone?
The government.
The government or a judge
or the company
or the law. Yeah. Who are computer experts, or how old are judges and juries? Well, first off, how old are judges usually?
Can't remember the age requirement, but they're kind of old.
Yeah, they're generally, like, think about the Supreme Court. Yeah, they're older. They're usually they're usually grandparents' age. Now, how many of you have ever tried to teach your grandmother how to use a computer? Or your grandfather, or your great aunt, or your great uncle, or your great however they identify?
Pretty slow. They don't adjust very fast.
Yeah, they don't adjust very fast. And very often, like, they don't even understand what it is you're trying to teach them. And this is not like their fault. It's just computer technology is changing constantly. And if you aren't growing up in an environment with computers, it's very hard to learn it. So here are these issues where if you tell somebody that someone else like hacked into your computer and put a backdoor and installed some spyware, well, who's going to be in charge of deciding how bad of a crime this is? Very often, it's going to be non-experts, going back to a professional ethics class. On a lot of these cases, genuine cyber crimes, because they're so new and we often fall back on older laws, who ends up having to decide whether the crime is worse or better is somebody who really doesn't have the expertise needed to decide these things. So very often what we find is the crimes are just like totally not lined up with like intuitively how bad something is. And very often what you end up with are cases in which the legal punishments for something don't seem to line up with what was going on. And what ends up happening is judges and courts use these old laws and apply them to new cases. So to take another classic, a problematic case that we'll talk about more in a few weeks, but it's useful to bring up now. Child pornography, images of underage people being forced to engage in sexual activities, or pictures of underage people who are being observed or exchanged amongst people who are over the age of 18 for sexual reasons. Now, why am I bringing up child pornography in this context? Well, it's because how is child pornography legislated against? What are the laws around it? Well, they are generally things like no individual is allowed to exchange images of anyone who's underage. And these laws, as child pornography laws, have been around for a very long time. And the problem is that child pornography laws were created in an era before these became prevalent. People with camera phones are now able to exchange consensual nude images of themselves very easily. However, what happens is that because these photos are so easy to take and exchange, and because the people with the phones are very often under the age of 18 if they're in high school, what ends up happening is 16-year-olds are receiving photos of 14-year-olds, both of whom are consensual, and yet these count as technically illegal and under child pornography laws, such that whoever takes or sends these photos ends up being charged and put on a sex offender list. This is an actual case where there were some 14 and 15-year-olds sending each other nude photos in a high school. This was about 10, 15 years ago, and they were charged for exchange of child pornography. And so this is a case in which like the punishment is having to fall back on these older laws from these cyber-related crimes, even though these new, like exchanging a digital photo is a genuine cyber activity. So if it's illegal, it's a genuine cyber crime, but the only laws in place are from these sorts of older crimes. So does everyone see the tension here of our laws are not designed to deal with genuine cyber crimes? And because cyber technology is changing so quickly, as the laws begin to catch up, the technology moves on even faster. And we end up with cases in which you can be punished for things in a much harsher way than you'd think appropriate, because that's the only thing that we have in place at this time.
Professor, I was going to say another thing also. Like our judicial system and the way we pass laws is at odds with the rate exponentially, how technology is growing exponentially. So, and I don't see a way where we can catch up, my opinion.
And that's a major, major issue. That's a great point. So did everyone catch that? It's basically, how quick does technology change?
Constantly advancing.
Yeah, it's constantly advancing, and it's advancing so fast. How quickly does the law change?
It takes years and years, decades, sometimes centuries.
Years and years, exactly. And so what's the problem? Well, we have all these new technologies that are being passed all the time, which bring up lots of new legal issues. Things like to take the clear case, nude photos, things like digital downloads, things like hacking sorts of concerns, things like how much responsibility should a company have to make sure that if they're selling you a product, that product is digitally safe. It has been tested to make sure that it's not going to be easily hackable. Well, we don't have the laws in place to ensure that these technologies are being protected. And because of that, our laws are just falling farther and farther out of touch with the technologies. And so there's just this major, I think I brought this up earlier in the semester, but I'll say it again, policy vacuum. So a policy, I never know how to tell vacuum, but vacuum is an empty space. And so there's an empty space with no laws and no policies. And so we'll be talking more about regulation and what to do. But I think Jorge's onto something of like, just there isn't a good solution at this point. So along these lines, just practically speaking, what this means is you cannot use common sense when trying to decide whether or not something you're doing on the internet is illegal. Because like commonsensically, if it's so easy to copy a file that your cat could do it by accident just by stepping on the keyboard in the right way, commonsensically, you think to yourself, well, this can't be that bad. If a cat can do it, it cannot be a bad crime. However, the fact is, you can go to jail for a long time if you download too many files. And it comes down to, you have to know yourself, like, what are the punishments where you live? What are you guilty of? What can you be charged for? If you have to be aware, and you have to be extra careful for your own sake when interacting with people on the internet. If you're pretending, you know, it might seem easy to make a joking threat to someone on the internet in a way that you know is joking. But if you're on the internet, that could be taken as a literal, it can be taken as a threat, which you can be charged for, just like being aware of these things. The Capitol break-in that happened, why are so many people able to get charged for the break-in to the Capitol? What is the main reason that so many people are getting charged? And I mean this practically speaking, not like you shouldn't break into the US Capitol. That goes without saying. I mean, why is it the case that this is so many people are being arrested nationwide? What did many of them
because
do?
they went physically there?
Yeah, social media and videos. Like these people, if you break in somewhere, if you're surrounded by a large crowd of people and everyone's doing it, you might think this isn't that big of a deal. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not being violent. But the moment you post it online, you are literally like thinking to yourself like, oh, this is just me posting on social media. Your social media is by definition something which can be used against you in court. You have chosen to do this, and anything out there can be used against you. So just like commonsensically, you think, well, it's just cyberspace, but you need to keep these things in mind, practically speaking. So what I wanted to really highlight here, the main things I wanted to highlight is this difference between the cyber-related crimes and genuine cyber crimes. And why it's important to keep this apart is because they have practical considerations for how people get punished and how difficult it is to decide who gets punished, and the fact that they lead to these policy vacuums, which means that you need to be careful in the internet when you're on the internet, because things which might seem totally innocuous end up being majorly problematic and you can be doing things that you don't realize are illegal, and yet the punishments are very large. Other ways, you can do something that seems perfectly or like really bad and it be totally fine, legally speaking. So that was the first thing. Now, the second thing I wanted to say is this sense of and this is a more general sort of difference. The differences between individuals carrying out certain types of actions and nations carrying them out. So why am I bringing this up? Why am I stressing this difference here? What is it about individuals versus nations carrying something out that matters? Why is it that if it's me and my friends breaking into the CIA computer system or the cloud associated with the Pentagon versus the Russian government doing it? Why does this matter? Why is this worth talking about and highlighting? Yeah, so one thing is individuals are relatively easy to punish. If you find out who they are, you are then able to punish them pretty easily. You can say like, you hacked in, we're punishing you. However, so let's talk about this SolarWinds case. What is the SolarWinds hack, which happened a few months back? And I'm bringing this up because it's useful to know, one, what sorts of hacks can happen, 2, what the potential consequences are, and 3, why they lead to these really big issues around what the hell are supposed to be done with these hacks. So how many people heard of the SolarWinds hack when it was happening?
I have.
Okay. Anyone want to take any stabs at describing what it was while I take a sip of water?
Basically, it was I believe it was SolarWinds. I think it was the company that it was like a big, like the main company that had provided security software, and everybody who used their software basically got affected because they got somebody hacked into it by using a supply chain attack. And then like there's this whole, and we're still researching it today. I think that they're still finding out what the scale of the damage is, because there is just so much damage because like the main company got hacked, so everybody who used it under them got hacked, or like were most likely affected as well.
Yeah, that's a very good description, Marcus. I just want to highlight a couple things. So first off, what is a supply chain attack? Does anyone know? Basically, what a supply chain hack is instead of hacking into a software program once it's with the consumers, you hack into it when it is with the production company. And specifically, you install malware into it that will then continue being distributed to anyone who gets that software. So in this case, what it was is they installed a backdoor in the program. Now, what's a backdoor? Basically, a backdoor is something that allows you to access the computer system without actually having to log on to it. It's a second way into the system. So what they did, this hacker group, is SolarWinds is one of the largest computer security companies in the world, and they are not like your local like Norton that you install on your MacBook. They are rather responsible for providing security to things like the CIA, things like Citibank. I'm not sure if Citi uses them, but like large banks with billions of dollars. Things like the Pentagon. Things like the German, I can never remember what it is, but basically their version of Congress, senators, the US government, basically all these major companies that have billions of dollars, and then major government organizations with lots of private data. Now, this company was responsible for it, and what happened was a group, before this newest version of the data, of the program, the security programs went out, they installed it so that when this got installed on all these computer networks, what it basically allowed is that once this was on there, the original people who put the supply chain backdoor in could now access the computer system for any one of these organizations. And not only that, because it was a backdoor, once you have backdoor access into a computer system, you can generally use that and kind of snowball it into more information. So once you are in, you can do things like give yourself administrative control over that network and start doing things like downloading files, sifting information, collecting things. So what this basically was, this SolarWinds attack, is that we don't know exactly how much was taken because these people, basically the hacker group was in the computer network of all of these major companies for about 9 months. And if you think about computers and how quickly information is transferred, that is gigabytes upon terabytes of information being collected from all these major companies. And so this was a case in which just the amount of information being collected is huge. And because we don't quite know who all was hacked, because who all actually downloaded the updates and everything is unclear. And once you're in a computer system, it's very easy if you have administrator control to erase any evidence that you were there. So we don't know what information was collected. And we also don't know quite where this information went. All the evidence points to what? Well, that it was the Russian government. And there was a special cyber team within the Russian government's cyber, like their version of the CIA cyber network or cyber team. But that doesn't really help us that much. So what we have here then is a nation who is doing all of this. So does everyone just get the general gist of how the attack worked, what it was, and then why it's such a big problem? Jorge, did you want to say something?
Yeah, Professor. I was going to say also to mention the nations versus individuals. The individual might not have the resources to hide his activities, but you can figure out that a nation took part because it's so hard to figure out who did it or who to point to. So even today, I read that we don't know. We just think it's the Russians, but we don't know exactly who perpetrated this.
So here's one major difference is the nations have a lot more resources. So generally speaking, with these sorts of attacks, we know based on the size and scale that it almost certainly was a nation state. The problem is, and this ties back in with cyber, of just like the Russian government will never say, you're right, we did it. Why? Because they have no reason to do so. Instead, they will deny. And so even if we are almost certain it was the Russian government, what can be done about it? And this is another major difference here. With individuals, you can do things like punish them. We don't know for certain that this individual did it, but we can put them on trial. What are we going to do? We can be 95% sure that the Russians did it, but what can you do about it? And this is a literal practical question. What can you do about it?
Professor, this is my opinion, but I think that it's much easier to punish individuals than nations, because like the way our system works is nations put, write down laws and pass legislation. So it's hard to punish nations, like a nation against another nation is much harder to just punish their individuals.
Yeah, so one thing is the laws generally apply within a nation. So Russia follows Russian law, the United States follows US law. And so one issue is that these nations, you can't just, there is like you can go to the UN and complain, but that's about all you can do. So when nations get mad at each other, what do they generally actually do to one another? What are the ways in which nations kind of punish each other?
Embargoes.
Embargoes, yeah. Embargoes are one. So one thing you can do is put embargoes or sanctions on a nation.
Sometimes you would expel
by saying like, we aren't gonna give you things. Wait, somebody was saying something, I cut them off. Was that you, Jorge?
Yeah, sometimes like expel their like ambassadors or.
So these are things that can be done. You can put sanctions on a nation. You can put embargoes on them. You can expel diplomats and other sorts of things. But what's the worry? Like, for instance, sanctions and embargoes. These things are done a lot, but why is it that these things are not always that effective? So what are the issues with embargoes and sanctions? So an embargo is basically like, we will not accept your goods. And sanctions are to say, if anybody trades with you, we will punish them. Or if you want to trade with us, you will have to do this. Or every one of our allies stop taking supplies from this nation. Why do these sorts of things not work in every case? Well, very often, who are the nations that are carrying out these sorts of cybercrime? So let's go with the classic one, North Korea. North Korea has one of the largest cyber, what's the best way of putting this? Basically, cyber espionage networks in the world. They have huge numbers of hackers that are highly well trained at entering into systems. Why don't sanctions and embargoes work? Like, why is it the case that we can't, like, we find out North Korea does something, and then what can we do about it? Well, we put more sanctions and embargoes. Why doesn't that necessarily work with North Korea? There's two reasons for it. What can you tell me about North Korea as a nation in terms of money? Rich or poor? Anyone know?
North Korea.
North Korea.
Poor? Rich? I don't know.
I think it was rich.
About North Korea. North Korea is a nation that, as a matter of fact, has been controlled by an incredibly powerful dictator there have been 3 in a row, but basically North Korea as a nation is set up in such a way that they are completely cut off from the rest of the world for all intents and purposes. And they have a dictatorial leader in charge who has access to nuclear weapons. He and his family are wealthy as hell. However, everyone else in the nation is dirt poor because they are living in, it's one of the most autocratic controlled governments in the world where the leader is in charge of everything. Now, because of this, we have for years had sanctions on North Korea. And basically for the past 30 years, North Korea has had heavy sanctions and heavy embargoes. Now, because of this, we can't, so there's 2 reasons these aren't working, or it wouldn't work. If North Korea hacks us, we've already put so many embargoes and sanctions on them that putting more isn't going to do anything. Secondly, North Korea, the people who are going to get hurt by these sanctions and embargoes are not the wealthy leader who's so wealthy and already had sanctions. It's the average person who's making less than $1 a day US. So there's this thing of like, embargoes and sanctions aren't going to work if the people are already getting embargoed and already getting sanctioned. Another issue is if you put an embargo on another nation, what does that nation usually do back?
Retaliate?
Yeah, they retaliate very often by giving you embargoes. So a case would be the tariffs during the Trump administration. When he was putting tariffs on Chinese goods, the Chinese just put the tariffs back. And so with nations like North Korea or Iran, in which there's less power on that side, what you can do is put sanctions, you can put embargoes, but in these cases, what can end up happening is they don't do any good because the nation's already been embargoed the hell out of. On the flip side with China, if you put embargoes, it's going to end up hurting you just as much as it hurts them because they're another powerful nation. So these sorts of things don't necessarily work. Now, there's one other issue, or what is the last resort in all diplomacy? Henry said it, it's war. If somebody hacks into your network, you could always go to war with them. But there feels something over the top about this. Like no nation has ever declared war on another nation due to cyber crimes or cyber espionage. And there's this worry here of you don't want to be the first nation to declare a war on someone because of a cyber attack. Cyber attacks that attack computer systems, there feels something like nobody wants to be the first one to be like, no, this time you attacked our yada yada, that's war. We are going to put literal troops on the ground in your nation. The other reason is the moment you escalate to war, other things like nuclear weapons suddenly get on the table and nobody wants nukes flying around. So there's this weird thing with nation states where there's no real way of punishing another nation state. You can't be like Russia, you're naughty, therefore we're not going to start a war with Russia just because they hacked in and stole this information. But on the flip side, the amount of information they stole from us is so large that it can have major effects. So this is the thing that's worth pointing out is individuals versus nation states can lead to these major differences in terms of how we approach like individuals versus nations can change the way we look at cybercrime or cyber-related crime. And specifically, what it means is you can get caught up in these sorts of criminal activities that you are not going to be able to protect yourself from because they're being carried out by nations. And also nothing's really going to stop the nations from carrying them out. So more and more, like there are more and more cyber attacks every year because what these nations have discovered is that there's really nothing in place to stop them from attacking each other. So is everyone on board with just this general thing of like, this is and cyber warfare is something, or cyber espionage is something which never existed before, and we don't really have anything in place for dealing with it. So does everyone understand that other general worry here just worth highlighting and just being aware, why are hacks happening all the time? Well, part of the reason is that the people doing the hacking are nations and there's no consequences really for doing this. Because if you're a big, powerful nation, there's not really that much punishment outside of a war, which no one is going to call. And if you're a small nation, the reason you're resorting to cyber is because of the fact that you're already getting punished and there's not that much they can do to you because you're smaller and poorer and have less digital infrastructure.
Professor, just one point. I wanted to mention that I think for me the problem is that the punishments never are directed to the leaders of those nations, like personally, you know, as an individual. I think that's a major problem.
And I think that that's a really good point, because our general idea with punishment is you punish an individual. And this is what we were talking about. This kind of ties back into the many hands problem from from several weeks ago, which is like, the only way that would actually manage to get a government to stop doing these things is if you punished individuals. But so what are you going to do? You're going to say, hey, Putin, you were responsible for this. And Putin's going to say something like, one, you can't prove it was even Russia. And even if you could, I didn't give the orders. This was a government that was just a government organization acting alone with no whatever. So it's almost, the only way that you would see, as Jorge says, real consequences is if individuals were punished. But there's just nothing in place that would allow individuals to be punished, which is going to bring me to the last point, which is law enforcement and computers. And what I want to talk about here is some of the ethical issues and practical issues that come up with law enforcement and computers. Because what's the main way we deal with crime? We get the police involved. And this, in the case of computers, leads to some ethical issues. So I want to open this up because my back is hurting from talking so much. What are some of the issues that arise the moment you start looking at law enforcement and computers? What are some of the practical worries that come up? And what are some of the theoretical sorts of ethical or big picture concerns that might come up when we're talking about law enforcement and computers hand in hand?
How much can the law or the police and like other related government things can like find? So like what you said before with Face ID, like you can unlock somebody's face or like force somebody to unlock their phone using Face ID. You never know like if they're spying on our computers because you know the government.
Yeah. So one set of worries that comes up is that law enforcement, to combat cybercrime, is more and more employing digital technologies of their own. And a lot of the time, these digital technologies lead to concerns for privacy and that sort of thing. So did anyone in the reading pick up on the little case study that was provided at the start of the chapter? It was like right there at the beginning. Basically, the case was this. Somebody was arrested for having connections to a drug trafficking group. This woman was arrested, her phone was confiscated. And what the cops did is they basically impersonated her on her Facebook to try to engage with other people in this organization. So they did things like take pictures off of her phone and post them on her Facebook and write messages to people on their Facebook to make sure to try. So you try to do things like she was dating another member of this drug trafficking organization. And so they sent a message as her to somebody else. So basically they were using identity theft and posting and controlling her Facebook with the hopes of using that to make somebody else in the group put themselves in a compromising position. And so there's worries here around like, should this be allowed? Like, to combat these sorts of things, police are using more and more creative ways of using cyber technology. And a lot of cases, these are opening other privacy cans of worms.
Professor.
Yeah.
In this case, even though the woman received money at the end, like a settlement, the agency would not admit that what they did was wrong, you know?
Yeah, that's a great thing to bring up, because like the law enforcement agencies are not saying this is a problem. They say this is just doing good police work. However, there is this concern of like, if a cop is impersonating you. Also, I've had students in this class who are police officers. Like they are getting their degree after having been a cop for several years, and they have told me about things that have happened. And so, for instance, you know that there's somebody who you're almost positive did something, but you have no proof of it. So what are some of the ways, and you think that this person has probably posted about it on Facebook. So if you are a police officer and you are interested in getting information off this person's Facebook, what can you do? And I'm talking the average police officer, not somebody with a major hacking ability. What could you do in this case? Anyone have any guesses about what the most common way of doing this? And this is things that actually happen in police departments.
Friend those people?
Yeah, you friend those people, but do you friend those people as yourself?
No, as like a made up.
Yeah. And specifically, if say this individual you're trying to get to friend you is a 22-year-old male, what might you make this fake profile?
Female.
Yeah, you will go to Google image searches, look up attractive woman, take generic photo, make a fake Facebook account, friend request this guy, and all of a sudden, everything this individual has said on the Facebook is now accessible to you. And you can now use that, and this is admissible because they chose to friend you. Is this an ethical concern? Well, I think on one hand, a lot of people are going to say, no, you have to do this thing in law enforcement in a new world in which everyone is doing things digitally. However, like there's another side of like, this is somewhat, you might think this is somewhat concerning because sometimes the sorts of things that happen are not necessarily, if the cop is doing this to catch a murderer, we generally are feeling okay about it. But these sorts of things were being used to identify Black Lives Matter protesters. And these sorts of things are happening. And there's this worry here of, are these privacy concerns being, are law enforcement violating privacy concerns in the course of trying to fight against crime? There are lots of other sorts of issues on this sort of thing. But what are some, yeah, correct.
Professor, I wanted to ask you, is there, how before you go into someone's house, you need like permission. So you don't need any permission to like survey somebody online right now?
No. If they friend request you, no. If you want to hack in or gain access another way, you might need a warrant. But in terms of if you friend request someone and they accept it, legally, that's perfectly fine. It's just a matter of if it's like if it's public Facebook, you need nothing because it counts as a public space. If it's a private account and they friend request you, then I think it's in an open gray area where legally speaking, if you have access to this, like I don't think there's technically any law against putting a different photo than yourself up and then using that. Now, if you were to hack into someone's account without their permission and do it, then you might say, yes, it is illegal. But in terms of if you make a fake profile and go and interact with someone, nothing against that. Also, if you have a Snapchat that's public, if you have a like a public Snapchat that somebody can see, then that right there, anything you post there counts as public information. So other cases have been found of like somebody will Snapchat themselves, like somebody will be wanted for an interrogation or something. They'll Snapchat themselves hanging out in the park. 2 seconds or 20 minutes later, the cops will roll up because they knew because this person publicly put their information. Andrew, what do you mean by crime mapping in this context? I've heard it used in a couple different ways. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. So controlling crime in an area using digital sorts of technology. So yeah, so there are also ethical worries here of choosing an area in which like it's deemed high crime and then putting lots of emphasis on those areas. And very often what ends up happening is that these decisions are being made based on things like data mining. So you look and see which areas have higher crime rates. And then you just decide, well, they've had higher crime rates before, therefore we need to have an extra police presence in the area, which can then lead to other sorts of problems. And this is something in which, like, using digital technologies like this does raise privacy concerns because of controlling crime using this sort of mapping by just deciding, like, oh, this is the case. Another thing that ties in with this, though, is the technologies being used are not perfect. And these can themselves, and this is something we'll come back to again, is a lot of this privacy stuff is also tied in with using new technologies, some of which are concerning just because of their privacy stuff, but also just because the technologies are themselves imperfect. So for instance, let's talk face recognition for a second. So a lot of, there's finally starting to be a reduction in this, but lots of law enforcement organizations were using facial recognition software. So what are some worries about using facial recognition software? Has anyone heard of what some of these issues are and why I'm bringing them up? So how does facial recognition work?
Oh, you brought up the issue of it not being able to determine identify people better than others, like based on their race, because like the people they used it on as the test subjects were based on that race, so it was easier to, or harder to difficult determine people. And it's really with face, it's like all about it's a lot about eyes too. Like they get, like they have the information about your eyes and then they store it.
Yeah, so what it basically is a face pops up and it basically picks out a whole bunch of points on the face, maps them and stores them in a computer system. And then when a face is viewed through a camera, it then compares those numbers to what something that's stored. Now, ideally, this would have a 100% match rate, where if it says, yes, this is a match, it would get it correct 100% of the time. But it's technology, so it's not always right. Now, one of the issues was cases in which the law enforcement was using this to identify whether, like, so you had a security footage of a like robbery at a gas station. So then you compare the face at that gas station with a bunch of potential suspects. And what you do is you like match up what was on that, and then when you bring in the lineup, you compare the faces. The issue was that it was consistently getting it wrong for certain races and always getting it right for another. So if you were specifically if you were Black, you were far more likely to actually be innocent and be accused of fitting the crime because the facial recognition software picked up on it wrong. So this is another worry of, with these sorts of technologies where they're being controlled by third-party companies that design them, but then being used to make important decisions, implicit biases and racial problems that are, or any sort of biases that are built into the system can lead to problems. All right, there are some other issues with law enforcement and computers that I want to talk about. So what are some other issues that people can think of? And I'm dying up here in terms of losing my voice and things, so I'm going to make somebody else talk for a second. So somebody else think of another issue with law enforcement and computers. So fingerprint, I think, falls in with this one, of just technologies that aren't always perfect and lead to issues.
Oh, yeah, it's like law enforcement and computers is like, how far does it go up the government? Like, do you really want the whole government to not, like, be able to use it? Like, it's I don't know how to explain it. It's like there's a difference between state and federal, right? But then there's also the issue of should the police be like kind of like how far does it go up to the federal government, like that type of thing, where like and then it becomes like the whole thing where it's nation versus people, where like, do you really want your whole, like, it's like China basically. Like China is like a good example of how far they could take it if they have like with the laws.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point, is basically the more information you have about criminals, the safer everyone's going to be from one another. The issue is the more information you have about criminals is also the more information you have about every single subject of your nation. And the more information a government has about a subject, the less power the subjects have or the citizens have relative to the nation. So that's another issue here. But here is one I want to talk about. Where does the law operate? If you punch someone in the face, you walk outside right now, you punch someone in the face, what laws are you punished by?
Usually the state.
Yeah. Or so city, state. What is the possible concerns that come up with computers and these issues? And we've talked about this a bit before. There's two related concerns.
I can't remember, but basically I think it's more of like who polices it, where like the what was it, Google or Facebook blocked off Australia because of they didn't want to accept something.
Yeah, so there's this major issue here of who does the policing. If you commit a physical crime, you're in a physical location, and the people who punish you are in charge of that jurisdiction. So if you commit a crime in New York City, it'll be either the New York City police, or it'll be the New York State police, or it'll be the United States government police. However, there's going to be issues here of what? Well, if you are, what's the obvious case? If I steal your identity, I take your wallet, it's pretty clear. What's the problem though? How is most identity theft happen these days?
Cyber.
And specifically, if you get your identity stolen, where are they stealing it from? And I don't mean where are they taking it from, I mean, where are they when they are taking it?
Probably like in there. Wait, you mean like when somebody steals your identity, where that person is?
Exactly.
Usually it made probably in their home, and then they use a bunch of like things like VPNs and like a whole bunch of other security related stuff.
So there's two issues here. One of which is harder to catch people because they're going to be far away. But a second issue is, even if you know where they are, there are still problems. If you are hacked by someone living in Moscow, what is the issue with that? If you're
Foreign immunity.
Yeah, who punishes you? Whose jurisdiction are you under? So if you're hacked by a Russian citizen, who is in charge of punishing that person? Well, it depends on the hack. It depends on where they are. But practically speaking, if your credit card number is stolen by somebody currently living in Russia, what's going to happen to that?
Pretty much nothing.
Nothing's going to happen. Why not? What would it take to punish this person?
You would have to get the Russian government involved.
Yeah, the Russian government would have to agree to send this person to the United States to face trial. And the Russian government isn't going to bother doing that. The US government and the Russian government don't get along great. So they're not going to be like, yes, we'll ship them over. No, that's not going to happen. So there's these issues of extradition, which is taking somebody from one nation and bringing them to another. But also there's going to be jurisdictional issues of, just practically speaking, of laws are different in different places. And because of this, it can lead to a lot of actual legal issues of what you're doing is legal in one place and illegal in another place. And so is this person breaking the law? So you've got cases of what counts as illegal information being different there than here. So if, for instance, there are places in which looking at pornography is illegal. So if you host your website in the US, but it's accessed by somebody in a nation where it's illegal to view pornography, can you be punished for it? Or another case is if it's illegal in your state to gamble on sports, but you go through a website that's hosted somewhere else, can that website be punished for accepting your money? Can you be punished if you've accessed a website that's overseas? There aren't clear answers to these questions. And importantly, there's no major governments or supra-governmental organizations that are in charge of doing these sorts of things. So there's also these practical concerns of where should the punishment come from, who's responsible for it, and how the hell are we supposed to catch somebody who's halfway around the world? And even if we do, how are we going to punish them? So what we're finding is law enforcement is just finding it harder and harder to punish people when these sorts of crimes are being committed from all over the world. And because of this, it's making it easier and more likely for people to try hacking. If you know you're not going to get in trouble for it, then there's no risk in doing this sort of thing. So does everyone understand that final sort of practical issue? All right, does anyone have any last questions or points on this? All right, I'm completely out of gas in terms of talking. So if anyone has anything else they want to bring up, feel free to bring it up now. If not, I will just say have a good rest of your weekend, or have a good weekend, have a good rest of your day and good weekend. And I will talk to everyone next week. I will be going over paper drafts this afternoon and getting them back to you. And I will see everyone next week.
Thank you, Professor.
Absolutely.
All right, take care.
Bye.